Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. And audio's okay? Everybody hear and see? All right, I'm seeing some head nods. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself as we get going, but I am with Northwest PBIS. Most of our staff are physically located in Oregon. We've got some of us in the Eugene area, Portland, and then we have a new trainer coming on board who's in Bend. But we do serve California, Washington, Idaho, as well as Alaska. And then we, for some of our remote events, have schools really all across the country that participate in some of the training opportunities that we provide. And so I'm excited to be here with you all, thinking about your role as school safety staff and how we can support school culture and climate. And so I just want to give thanks to many folks who have contributed. As Chris shared, Jessica Swain Bradway presented to your group last year. So I'm using some of her content, but also lots of colleagues and mentors in this work that really influence my knowledge. So in our time together, this is probably my least favorite way to be with you all because you're all together and I'm not with you. But I want you to do what you need to do in terms of taking care of your needs. I know we just came back, or we were coming in from a break, so that's great. Stop me if you have questions. I may not hear you right away since the distance, so wave your hand or have somebody pop in. I'm going to do some pause moments to let you reflect. This would be a good opportunity. I know you have to do some journaling as part of your logging for your units. And so I'll give you some places for that and maybe even some tips and things that you can put in there. And then, if you have anything that you want to extend on, please ask. It's okay to disagree with some of the things that I say. I'm going to share from my perspective, but I would love to know yours. And I'm going to tell a few stories and share a few maybe jokes. So, humor me as we go. So I want to start with this one. Curious, how do you like your toast? So as we warm up this morning, this is a nice little grid. And so you can look at the letters across the top and the numbers across the side. And I would love for you to choose the one that represents you. And then if you're curious what your toast says about you, there's actually a website you can go to and it'll tell you a bit about what your toast says. But curious where we're landing. So pick yours and tell your neighbor, and maybe somebody can tell me if we've got a general consensus in the room or lots of diversity. Where are you with your toast? What do we have here? Anybody on the top left quadrant up there really prefer it to not be toasted? What about the bottom left side? Got some folks landing in that side. Far right, top right. Yeah, I'll tell you, you're going to get to meet or see my kids here in a minute. My son, Eli, his babysitter actually did this with him because he said he liked his toast burnt and she was unsure what that meant as a new babysitter. And so he selected F8. And then about, I don't know, a couple months later, I pulled it up and asked again. And he's 7 and he still was strong on the F8. And so Chris and I were talking about this content and this presentation, and he was saying in his house, his son was asking why the toaster goes all the way over to like setting 6 or something, and it's because of my kid. So you can look up and see what your toast says about you in terms of the level of burntness that you'd appreciate. Did we have anybody falling in that kind of far right corner like my son, Eli? Like the charcoal effect? All right. So hopefully that was a fun start that you weren't expecting, but just to give you a chance to think about ways that we can build relationships. Doesn't always have to be all serious business, but in our time together, I want you to come away today with understanding two main principles about restorative practices, and then at least 2 to 3 strategies that we can use. I'm hoping that you can personalize your experiences that you bring to this and really think about the aspects that you can leverage in your role as school safety staff. And then as we go, I would love for you to take notes and think about action plan. What are the things that you can control moving forward to really integrate these principles and practices as part of the places that you're going to be supporting? So as a foundation, restorative practices are an approach to discipline. And when we think about the definition of discipline, really that involves teaching, right? It's not about punitive consequences. That's not really what discipline is. If I say you are well disciplined, right, you have a strong knowledge and have been well taught. And so we are really focusing on this notion that people are worthy and deserve positive relationships. And the only way that we can really do that is by investing first in prevention with all of our kids, our families, and our staff. And we can't prevent challenges if we don't know the folks that we're working with. And so really restorative practices is about relationships first and above things like blame and punishment. It doesn't mean that there's no accountability for our behaviors, but that we can't create meaningful accountability if we don't have those relationships. And then when we are thinking about harm that's been done by an offense, those primary stakeholders are really invested in that role of how do we repair this? And that's going to depend, right? And so when we think about small children and forcing apologies, forcing kids to hug someone maybe when they don't feel comfortable, things like that are not examples of how we can best repair, right? We want to look at both sides of those relationships. And so we'll be talking about that. So since I said relationships matter, I want to tell you a little bit about me and my family, and then give you a little bit of why I'm so excited to be talking to this particular group, and know a little bit about you. This is hard for me because you're all sitting together, and so hopefully somebody can capture some of this and share with me who's here. So I'm curious, maybe we can do this by a hand raise. How many of you are stepping into your school safety staff role fairly new? My sense is maybe quite a few of you may be coming in newer to this role. So 0 to 1 year in this. Good. What about more than 2 years? Anybody? Okay. And then what about for levels? How many of you are you supporting district-wide, so K through 12 or PK through 12? Okay. What about high school? Primarily. Middle school or junior high? Okay, I see some way in the back. Elementary? Okay, good. Let's see, how many of you come at this from a background as an educator? So you've moved into kind of a safety support role, but you were primarily in an education role before that. A few of you. How many of you from other roles such as law enforcement or first response, some other kind of outside of an educator role? Good. How many of you have children of your own that are school age? Cool. Good. Anything else I should know about this group? You all know each other well? Do you work with each other, or are you all kind of sitting by people you don't know? Yeah, lots of new faces. Good. Well, this is my crew. Not the first responder group over here. This is you. But so my background, I grew up in rural Arkansas. So bring that kind of perspective in terms of school safety. Everybody knew everybody. We knew our neighbors. I was the first kid on the bus and the last kid off the bus, and rode for about an hour and 15 minutes each way because we were rural. One stoplight in the town where I grew up. And it was a big deal when Sonic came in. That was our first fast food restaurant. My husband is also from Arkansas. I don't remember if I said that. We're both from Arkansas. He grew up in Jacksonville, so just outside Little Rock. And at the time when we were living there and growing up, Little Rock had a notorious reputation for one of the least safe places to live in the country, and lots of gang violence. His family is military. His brother, so my brother-in-law, works as a police officer now in North Little Rock Police Department. And so we bring that kind of perspective in terms of having family members that serve in roles of safety and support. I did my graduate work at the University of Oregon, lived in Portland for a little while, and then moved to San Antonio for several years. We loved lots of things about living in San Antonio, but if you've ever visited, the seasons there are kind of hotter, hottest. And so we moved back to the Pacific Northwest in 2014, and I spent 7 years as a school psychologist and district positive behavior support coach before moving into this role with Northwest PBIS. My daughter, Joey, is just about to turn 11. She just wrapped up 5th grade, and Eli is 7 and just finished up 1st grade. They both attend public school in our neighborhood, a different district from where my husband and I worked. My husband was trained as an athletic trainer, so not a personal trainer, but he actually worked at a high school in sports medicine and has now moved into administration at a local high school. I say all of this because when I thought about how to connect with you all in my experience, wearing a very different hat than what most of you wear, I thought back to something that was really impactful in our lives in terms of thinking about relationships and how folks in roles of school safety might be perceived. And so when Joey was almost 4 and Eli was 5 weeks old, we were hit head on at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon by a drunk driver. Totaled our car, was about 1.5 miles from our house. And when I think about this, and when Joey and I talk about it, of course, Eli doesn't remember, he was 5 weeks old. But what she remembers about that experience was that the firefighters who responded gave her a juice. And so her perception of safety and support by people that are in your roles was based on that experience. And how privileged that we are to walk into that type of relationship where she sees folks like you as someone who cares about her and supports her. And I get emotional talking about this because I also know that there are a lot of kids who that isn't their experience, right? That's not their experience with folks who are in safety and support roles. And so building those relationships really is the first thing and the most powerful part of this work. Okay, I didn't know I was going to be teary, but here we go. Okay, so when we think about restorative practices, this originated in the 1970s as an approach to criminal justice. So it was about mediation between victims and offenders, and again, really emphasizes repairing harm and not just about punishing offenders. But as you might know, right, as you can imagine, if you've been in an experience where you've been a victim of an event, right? When I think about my experience and, you know, the drunk driver who hit us head on and trying to repair that damage, different people are going to be in different places, right, in terms of how we repair that harm and what that means and looks like and feels like. And so it's really important that we start with that as a foundation. Restorative justice echoes ancient and indigenous practices employed in cultures all over the world. So even though this kind of approach might be newer to many of you and is newer in a lot of our schools in terms of an approach to education, it isn't a new approach to relationships. And it's really about including communities of care. So when we think about not just the victim, but also their families and friends, that's where we see this collaborative process called conferences and circles. And we'll talk about how that looks. Those of you that have been in schools, you may have seen some of these things happen where there's classroom conferences and circles to be able to, you know, if something is impacting more than a single individual, right? If a student has a big behavioral episode and it impacts the whole classroom, how we can kind of build that repair together. So I think I've said this about 6 times. If you don't take anything else away, hopefully it's that, which is that we first establish positive relationships. If there is nothing to restore to, then we can't have a restorative practice, right? So when people say, tell me about restorative practice, tell me about restorative justice and how I do this, the first question I always ask is, what is the culture and climate like in your classroom, in your school, where you're going? And so I want you to see that as your role first and foremost, is to help establish those positive relationships, being visible, being present, knowing kids' names, knowing who they are, so that when harm occurs, we then can think about how we can work through that process to actually repair, right, those relationships. The person who's harmed gets to think about what's an acceptable resolution. The person who causes harm should be taking responsibility and sometimes receiving treatment. So if, for example, in my situation where we were hit by the drunk driver, right, he had some accountability and some treatment parts of that in terms of, the things that led to that particular event. And then looking at how we reestablish reconciliation in the community and re-enter so that we can then have this successful relationship. So it's not about, there is accountability, but it's also about that community piece, right? And it's not about excluding kids in particular from instructional environments, but more about rebuilding and repairing that community. So discipline is both prevention and response. We want learning environments in which kids are included. We have federal, right, state obligations for kids to be attending school. Many of our kids who have challenges in being successful socially in school also have disabilities. And so they have even additional legal rights based on their disability eligibilities. And so we have to think about being intentional, systematic, and accountable. You cannot do this on your own. You are all going to be walking into buildings, districts, schools that have systems. And so one of the first things, if you're new into your system, is to ask yourself, what are those foundational practices? What is the school culture, community, climate like? And how can I invest in that? And I'm going to give you some strategies and suggestions as we go with our time together today. So a little bit of evidence. For every year of behaviors in place, it takes at least 1 month for that behavior to have a significant change. So those of you that are working in high schools and you're working with adolescents, some of them have behavior patterns that have been in place for a very long time. And so if we're going to build new habits, that's going to take some time, right? It's not going to happen overnight. Even our kindergarteners, right? Some of them, by the time we see them, they've gotten some really established ways that they communicate and get their needs met in their households before they come to us in school. And so we have to make these investments and know that change is going to take time. There's some data to suggest that kids tend to comply with rules about 80% of the time, but we catch them doing that less than 2% of the time. So we want to think about how we can kind of flip that on its head, right? And really build that momentum in that positive direction. Are you all familiar with ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences? I'm seeing some head nods. Okay, good. So we know that a lot of our students who are going to need us the most come with a lot of adversity, right? And ACEs can be existing currently, or it could have been prior, right, exposure and experiences. And so when we have kids with a lot of adverse childhood experiences, they're coming from unstable, unpredictable environments. And so we want to work to create school, right, whether that's on the bus, whether that's in the classroom, the hallways, we want to create predictability and stability in their environments. And sometimes they push us on that, right? But all of us like knowing what's expected. We like when people behave in consistent and predictable ways, and when we feel loved and cared about. And so we want to be aware that the students who have a high number of ACEs are often acting out of that part of their brain that's the fight or flight, right? They are overreacting to things that seem really small. They might be carrying stress with them. And so one little thing sends them over the edge. And so lots of difficulty in managing behavior. And so just being aware of that and not taking things personally is really, really important. I've worked in some schools where one of the elementary schools that I served, over half of the students had at least one incarcerated parent. And so when you think about the kids walking in the door, all of them pretty much were coming with a high number of ACEs. And so staff were pretty aware of that, and had a lot of skill in kind of helping think about not taking behavior personally. But I've worked in other buildings where very different student population, and so only a few kids might be coming in that type of situation, and then teachers really not knowing how to interpret those behaviors or taking lots of things personally, because the majority of their kids are coming from homes and places where there aren't as many of those adverse events happening. So be aware of your context and your student population, and your staff population, right? What are teachers bringing to the table? So discipline works best when we use prevention to create more positive than negative consequences. So that's one thing that I think you can step in and you can control immediately, right? This is not just tickets and tokens and candy, but these are the smiles, the high fives, the side hugs, right? The things that people feel appreciated and welcome when they walk in the door. And we all get to play a role in that. And ultimately, we get what we pay attention to. So if you want to see more appropriate behaviors, that's where we really have to shift that feedback in that way. So I'm going to show you a short video clip about relationships and how one of the things I want you to notice in this is the role that everybody is playing. And then as it pauses, I'm going to give you a chance to reflect on how might you leverage, right, this in your role. I know you're going to be stepping in different ways, but as a school safety staff.
Hey, Mr. Q.
Did you see that? Why would somebody do that?
Please go into the classroom, no talking, quietly.
Hey, Miss Merida, how you doing?
We need you inside.
How do you think that makes us feel?
I forgot my number.
What's your name?
Jordan?
What's your last name?
Carter?
All right. Go ahead.
School is hard enough.
Come on in, sit down quietly at your desks, and begin writing.
This kind of stuff just makes it harder.
I said quietly, please. Who's talking? Is it you, Sophie? Don't let it be you.
Don't believe me?
Sophie.
Please just watch.
I'm not up here for me, I'm up here for you. Pay attention, okay? Now somebody answer me. Somebody needs to answer me really fast.
Every time we're ignored or yelled at or silenced, a teacher takes away what's possible.
No horseplay, no running, and especially no talking.
Moment by moment.
Miss McGarity, your students' behavior yesterday in the lunchroom, it was terrible. Next time, silent lunch.
Did you hear that? Stay in line and catch a bubble. I'm not playing.
If this is education, we're in trouble.
Bye, Miss McGarity.
Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you'll be forever free. The way it is now, 2 of the 3 of us will never be able to really read. It doesn't have to be this way.
Hey, Jordan, how you doing? Good.
Everyone we meet throughout our day can make a difference.
I've been waiting for you to arrive.
All the difference.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Great.
Hi, Jordan. Bye, Jason.
Good morning, Jordan.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. How are you?
Good.
Go ahead and put your number in.
Talk with
I
us,
don't know my number.
not at us.
That's okay. I'll look it up for you. Go ahead, sweetheart.
Okay.
All right. Have a
Teach us what we need to know.
Good morning.
That's how we get smarter.
Well, good morning, Sophie, Janicia, and Jordan.
And when you talk with us and teach us, give us bigger and bigger words.
Now what I'd like you to do, children, is turn around and converse with your neighbor and discuss where the mother might have gone.
Words that we can use to read and understand.
She has prey for eagles, so she hunts at night.
And that will take us places we could never reach without you.
Remember, we're entering the learning zone. Now, how can we show our respect to the children and teachers who are working?
We can walk quietly.
Yes. Okay, kids, so what I'd like you to do is continue writing your narrative, documenting your emotions if you were the baby owl and your mother abandoned you in the nest.
What can you do? Learn all that you can so that you can challenge us to be our best.
You would have stayed and assisted them in whatever they needed.
Share yourself with us and show us how to share ourselves with others. Give us courage. Give us compassion. Help us find our own voices so we can become who we are meant to be.
Why would you want a sign?
All right. So I want you to take a minute and turn to your neighbor. How could you leverage relationships in your role? Kind of thinking about that. What did you think? And if you don't have a neighbor, you can find one. All right, take about 10 seconds and then we'll come back together. Good, let's come back together. 3, 2, 1, and 0. Thank you. Anything that you discussed that would be helpful for me to hear? I ran across this resource fairly recently, which are some questions that you can ask to use to build relationships. I sent the handout, so these are in your handouts when you get access to those if you don't have them already. I love these for my own kids, but I also think for those kids that we might want to be more intentional with in building some relationships, questions like what inspires you, when do you feel cared for, when do you feel you're being listened to, what do you feel competent or good at school. Some of these questions really extend our relationship ability beyond the, how was your day? What do you like? What do you not like? And so I find this really helpful in having some go-to questions to be able to use to continue to build those relationships. And I don't know all the things that you talked about, but one of the things that I would say is if you're new to your school, probably people could tell you pretty quickly who are some kids to be really intentional in those relationships with. Maybe kids that have a history of not having strong relationships with adults and connections. Kids that you may need to be supportive of in other roles, right, as they go throughout the school year. And so if you can set up those positive impacts with their families as well, reaching out to them and, letting them know things that are going well can really help kind of establish that 5-to-1, right, those positives to correctives. So I would love for you to jot down 1 or 2 takeaway ideas. You can do this in your reflection journal if you're using that for your Unit 13, or you can jot it down on your notes, but that way you'll be able to have that ready when you get ready to submit for this unit. So I'm going to give you about 1 more minute just to jot down big takeaway ideas or connections that you've made from our first part of our time together. All right, spoiler alert, here are a couple of mine. So building relationships is prevention. We want to put relationships above blame. And then as we move into restorative discipline, really making sure that we're thinking about all the parties impacted with the goal of restoring relationships. So we talked about that you can improve behavior by pointing out what someone's doing correctly. The second bullet is one that I would love for you to start or highlight. A student is less likely to drop out of school if one other adult other than their teacher knows their name. So when I work with bus drivers, when I work with paraprofessionals, when I work with folks like you, this is the place where you have a special potential to have an impact. Because you are not going to be, I don't think, the person that's standing in front of kids trying to hold the math accountability over them. Right? Or teach them the content or ask them where their homework is, the things that are stressful and hard. And so you get to be that person who can kind of flip the script for a kid who had a rough morning. And when they come in the door, you high five them and, let them know that you care about them and that you're glad that they're there. And then they get into that classroom and then they've got, something hard in front of them in terms of their academics. And the same thing at the end of the day are those passing times. So this is a place where you can have a direct impact on students by getting to know them and knowing their names. And then that ratio of positive to negatives, the jury's out on whether it's a 4-to-1 ratio or a 5-to-1 ratio. But we've seen this ratio, research has shown that it impacts relationships. So marriages, John Gottman's done some work looking at lasting marriages and has been able to predict with high accuracy partners that will remain together 7 years based on collecting a little bit of data over a very short period of time around their positives to negative interactions. And again, it's not just the verbal, it's the nonverbal things as well. So the smiles, the thumbs up, the pats on the back, those kinds of things. When you give positives and build those relationships, use specific language with kids. We want to move away from the great job syndrome and into, I really appreciate that you were here on time. It's great to see you ready to go. That is going to increase the likelihood that that student engages or person engages in that behavior again. Also, sometimes we can leverage that, right? If I say, hey, I really appreciate that you're here being respectful, and other kids are standing around, then they're hearing, right? And so sometimes we can use that feedback as a way to correct other students without ever having to give a negative. Because we can say something that we appreciate that one student is doing, and then we see other students kind of fall into line about that. So pointing out what we're doing right, but know the students. Some are going to be mortified if you call them out in front of all their peers, right? For appropriate behavior. So you might have a special signal that you use with them, right? That you let them know that you see them. And then that last bullet of pair with currency from time to time are things like if your school is using school-wide acknowledgement systems. So a lot of our schools do have a ticket system or a way that kids can earn things and buy at the school store or earn privileges in their schools. Find out if your school's doing something like that. And if they are, then when you see kids doing things that are appropriate from time to time, pair that verbal with that currency that school is using. I even have bus drivers who they find out and they know and they give out those tickets. And so thinking about how you can kind of increase the buy-in there. It also allows students to celebrate their positive behaviors with others. So we have some schools that mail home. My daughter's school does Holt Bolt Awards, and those get mailed home. So then as a family, I see like, wow, you did this awesome thing. Your teacher was gone and there was a substitute. And it's just a little quick check thing. It probably took someone 15 seconds to fill it out, but it allows me to then support that behavior at home as well. So why is this reliance on relationship and a move away from punishment? So again, I'm not saying we don't have accountability, but I'm using words that are different, right? Because punishment alone doesn't teach what we should do instead. So punishment is only effective if I actually have another behavior in my repertoire to use. And a lot of our students who struggle with appropriate behaviors don't actually have another behavior in their repertoire. Also, a lot of the punishments that we use foster resentment, deception, and eventually exclude kids from the school community, right? And so we want to think about how can we support and create accountability while making sure that kids have the skills that they need to be successful. One of my favorite examples is, you're skipping school, so now we're going to suspend you. Excellent. I didn't want to be here anyway, right? And so now you are essentially reinforcing my inappropriate behavior by telling me that I can't come to school. So just being aware of that aspect of punishment and that sometimes it actually reinforces the behaviors that we're trying to get rid of. I want us to watch this short clip just and think about cultural context. This is another reason why relationships are important and understanding students' behaviors within context.
If you look at behavior, one of my favorite examples is teachers who work with, I'll use Mexican American students as an example, that really don't understand why it is that when they're reprimanding children, the children won't maintain eye contact. And so that is a cultural difference. Having grown up in a Mexican American home, I know that if my parents were reprimanding me and I looked directly at them, they would consider that an act of defiance. So looking away is a way of showing respect and an indication that you recognize that what you've done is wrong. And so teachers will look at behaviors like that, judging them from their own cultural base, and make a determination that it is a behavioral issue. And so they'll begin to treat children as though they have behavior disorders. But I think the point that's important is if you look at a behavior and it's common to a group, it's somewhat interesting that you as a teacher have not recognized that as a cultural difference. So it becomes really important for teachers to be sensitive to the fact that we communicate in different ways. We may not be comfortable if you ask for a public response, raising our hand and presenting ourselves as a knowledgeable person in front of our peers. And so teachers may consider that to be shy, withdrawn behavior, and if it persists over time, they may think about referrals. To me, every teaching act is a cultural act. It's the interaction of the culture of the teacher and the culture of the student. And if the teacher isn't aware of what the norms and expectations are for a particular student or a particular group, they will interpret the behaviors deficient in relationship to their own cultural preferences or norms for behavior. And so we have all kinds of examples like that. If students don't learn English quickly enough, teachers may think they have problems. If they go to back to their native country, or Mexico is a common example in Texas where I live, where kids will be gone for several weeks because they're visiting relatives. And so that interrupts their education. Teachers don't consider that interruption as the cause of the problem, so they don't fill in those gaps, and a student begins to look like a student with a disability. If you look,
and I think that impact, she's talking about it there a little bit in terms of academics, but we also see that in terms of social behavior impact, right? So if a student moves into your school or has irregular attendance, then they're missing those social opportunities as well to show what it looks like and sounds like. So for us, our role is to default to instruction, making sure that we understand that we've taught things. And so I don't know if any of you have seen this triangle. One of this is based on the public health model. We use it in education all the time, which is to show that the green part represents the full population, right? So all of us. And then the yellow part starts to represent when we have a risk. So maybe a health condition that would result in us needing some extra monitoring or some more frequent visits for support. And then at the top of the triangle where it gets more red is that more intensive kind of need. So thinking about someone that has a diagnosis of cancer per se, where they might be seeing a lot of specialists and getting a really individualized treatment plan, versus all of us that are doing our primary care, checkups and things like that. And so across this continuum, everybody has access to primary care, right? And then some of us have access to specialists and really individualized plans. And so we're embedding this instruction across. And so it's important that you know your school's culture and climate, also their expectations. And if it's a big long list of like do nots, then we might want to back up and say, well, what does do look like? I remember one time I was doing a session kind of like this, except for I was there in person. And we were talking about walking in the hallways. And somebody came up to me after the session and was like, oh my gosh, we spent so long this school year trying to figure out all the ways to say don't run. Because as soon as we said don't run, the kids are like, I'm skipping, I'm hopping, and she's like, if we had just focused on teaching them how to walk and what walking actually looked like and really reinforced that, we would have been way more efficient, because kids can come up with more things that we don't want them to do than what we can ever think of ahead of time to tell them not to do those things. So that default to instruction. We have a lot of evidence that zero tolerance policies in schools have been very ineffective. They have led to irrational, kind of inappropriate decision making. I remember, 15 years ago, I was in the gym working out, watching CNN on the TV up over the treadmill. And there was a little first grader that the parents were all up in arms because he was being put in a restrictive placement because he had brought a weapon to school. His weapon was a camping multi-tool, like those little utilities, like Swiss Army type knives. It has a spoon and a fork, and he was super excited to eat his lunch with his, camping fork. He had no intent to harm anyone, even though it was, inappropriate to bring to school. And because they had a zero tolerance policy, this kid was immediately suspended, even though there was no harm intended or no risk, right? And so while we are then engaging in that, we're actually missing those opportunities to really kind of build those relationships and identify those situations that are true risk. I didn't put the image on here, but I always think about TSA and whether or not we want our schools to feel like fly, right? What happens when you get ready to go to the airport and get, through security, and that, is that the culture that we want to create in our schools? And so how we can, have our safety pieces in place and good supervision and things like that, but really still looking at that strong stance against silence, those healthy relationships involving our community, so that we have, a place where we're preventing and doing real and meaningful threat assessment. All right, here's your chance. So jot down another note or takeaway, or tell your neighbor. I'm going to give you 1 minute, and then we'll keep moving through. Here's mine. So we had the first 3 already. And so the 4th one that I would add is just over-reliance on punishment is harmful to individuals and to our community. Any questions so far? Okay. Let's move into some of our restorative principles. I just want to hit on a couple of these so that if you hear people talking about them, you are familiar with them. They are the compass of shame, our social discipline window, and then fair process. And so again, at the core of all of these principles is putting in intentional effort to work with others to understand what caused the problem and how we can most effectively restore that person and that impact. So the compass of shame is what we want to avoid. You can see there that there are kind of 4 components. So withdrawal, attacking self, avoidance, or attacking others. And when we experience shame, we're less likely to actively learn or connect or feel belonging. And if we experience repeated shame, then we have, othering, the haves and the have-nots, and eventual, exclusion from the community. And so we want to, although shame can be effective in the moment, in stopping a behavior, it isn't a long-term healthy way to overcome harm. We also have the social discipline window. You can see the 4 quadrants here. So thinking about how you chose your toast and which quadrant you landed in. I would love for you to think about your kind of own experiences in social discipline and what led you to your current role, with the goal being that we land in that top right quadrant. That's what restorative practices are, when we're working with others to teach them skills, to be able to problem solve, to be respectful, to recognize and be responsive, that it's not the intent of our actions, Joey's, my daughter's a 5th grader, just finished up 5th grade, and we've had lots of conversations about that. I understand you didn't mean that to sound that way, or that eye roll to come across that way, but the impact is this. And so that's really what we're working on in that top quadrant. But a lot of us experience social discipline around punitive, right? You do this because I say, versus some of our students have experienced neglectful social discipline, right? Where I just kind of stop showing up. And then we also have that permissive kind of window down there, which is where the others are, consistently kind of excusing or letting things go. And so we really want to move toward operating here. So, quick activity. Where would you say you have operated as you started this work, or maybe in even your own school experience when you think about social discipline and what you experienced as a student if you haven't been in this field long? So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds just to share with your neighbor. Where have you operated or experienced social discipline? All right, let's come back together. 3, 2, 1. So in any of these, when we are bringing new learning, it's important for us to be aware of our own experiences, right? Because we have a tendency to continue to perceive the world based on the way that we experienced it. And so that's why I'm asking you to reflect here. And as you think about this learning, how, if you were in one of these other 3 quadrants, what that might mean for you in terms of active decisions to try to work toward this more restorative approach. So important information to keep in mind about human behavior is that we respond to what happens around us, and habits are built by building those neural pathways where we continue to respond. And we as humans keep behaviors that work and discard behaviors that don't work. And so a lot of kids have experience of, right, the way that I get my parents' attention, they're working multiple jobs, there's lots of kids in the home, they're really busy. But if I hit my sister, my mom's going to come over every time, right? Because there's going to be this thing that happens. Or if I say F you to my teacher, she's going to send me out of the class, and I'm not going to be up in front of the board having to do that problem and fail in front of my peers. So we want to think about creating environments that default to a safe place to be, and then setting up humans for success so that we can shape those neural pathways. So when we do our restorative practice, it falls along a continuum, right? From informal, which is just those effective statements and questions, to a more small impromptu conference, all the way to a very formal experience. And on that formal end, it's important that if we are doing restorative practice, that we actually have facilitators who've been trained. So your intro session here does not result in you being trained in that formal kind of conference process. And so you want to advocate that if you're being asked to be in that role and you haven't received restorative practice facilitator training and you don't have a script and things that you're working from, that you have access to that. So we want to give voice. We want parties to be engaged freely and safely. So that means we might not always be bringing everyone together, right? Victims might not feel comfortable sharing their experience in front of the offender. We want to have an explanation and transparency about our decisions. Also knowing, though, that oftentimes we have to protect privacy. So my daughter had an experience at school where someone made some physical contact with her that wasn't appropriate. And the principal let me know about that, but also let me know that they were going to be kind of understanding what happened and creating accountability, but that I did not have the privilege as a parent to know, right, those actual outcomes for that other student. And so we have to have that transparency while also protecting privacy in school settings. And then setting expectations for how do we move this forward and make sure that it doesn't happen again. Sometimes that involves treatment or, other pieces in terms of a plan. So I'm going to skip over this transportation example, but just knowing that we do this across settings, right? So this isn't just the school building, but also building this fluency and working together in all of those different places. My husband, worked in athletics. And so thinking about how we extend, the school culture and climate and relationship aspects into athletics and how we leverage that at those events, right? Sports events. Lots of kids are coming in to watch a football game and families. And how do we, make sure that we're promoting and supporting inclusive environments across those? All right. I think we're getting right at 11, but we started a few minutes late. I have about 5 more minutes. Is that okay, Chris? Or do we need to wrap it up here in the next minute? We're good? Okay, perfect. Okay, so strategies from restorative practices. We have circles, questions, and conferences. And so you may have seen those. Again, we want them to be voluntary, so we don't force either party or anyone to participate in this. If we're not ready, then we're not ready. We want to make sure, again, that we have trained facilitator and that we're following established rules for when we don't offer a restorative conference. So again, depending on the type of behavior impact, we may not actually bring the two parties physically together, and we should have some decision rules at the district or school level for that. So circles are really versatile practices. We can use them proactively. So some of you may be in schools where they do morning circle and they build relationship and community that way. And then we can also bring a circle together if something happened to problem solve how to move forward as a class. So again, these work best when it's part of community building, and then we also utilize it in the experience of a conflict. If your school is only doing it in response to a conflict, then we've kind of missed that preventative piece and it's not really aligned to best practice. And then again, we can have those informal kind of restorative ways that we structure interaction and work through students through the process, right? So kid comes up to you in the hallway or the parking lot and says this thing happens and it's not a real major thing. We might be able to just use this language to work through that. And then there's a more formal process where we have facilitators, we gather all the information, we follow a script, and then we have a clear action plan for next steps, both for all of the impacted parties. So some of the guiding questions are things like, tell me what happened, what were you thinking, what do you think about it now? That one's important in terms of looking to see if there's still understanding about why, who did this affect? What do you need to do about it? How can we make sure it doesn't happen again? And what can I do to help you? And again, for those more serious offenses, then we would follow this as a scripted set of questions. For the conference, this approach to repairing harm, again, should be structured and facilitated. You shouldn't be doing it unless you've been fully trained, because we have a lot of opportunities to do more harm if we're not really following the process carefully. And then thinking about how we involve stakeholders as well. We are still going to have accountability and consequences related to the wrongdoing, and then moving forward together in terms of how to repair and how to measure that repair, right? How do we know if we've actually done what we said we were going to do in terms of solving the problem? Okay. The Q-tip down there is one. Right, which is as the adults that are facilitating this process, a lot of times things happen to us, right? Kids call us names, they engage in behaviors that are hurtful or harmful to us. And so we have to move away from taking it personally and move into that place of, that's where that script and facilitated process can be really helpful, making sure that we're calm and neutral and able to move through. So within your district or school, best practice is to make sure that all of those practices, you're aware of them, including the restorative piece, right? So what is the system? Who all are the people that should be involved, and making sure that it's not just falling on you, making sure that we know how to measure success, and where's that accountability for follow-up activities? Who's taking that on? Is it an administrator? Is it a counselor? How are we differentiating those roles? And it may vary from problem to problem, but making sure that you're aware of those procedures. When we see patterns of chronic behavior, then we may need to involve a more intense assessment process. You might be involving more specialists to really get at why that pattern might be continuing, versus if it's a one-off, more isolated type of event, then this process may be sufficient to move forward. Okay, jot down your 1 or 2 takeaways here about that process. And I'll put mine up here. I'll give you a minute to take some notes. You don't have to copy, but you can compare. So for me, that number 7, right? Restorative practices are just a part of the continuum. If that's the only thing that your school is doing, then I would ask, we're restoring to what, right? Where's that foundation of teaching, building relationships, and establishing those positives? Okay, last couple of thoughts. We can't take things personally. People, kids and adults, sometimes have naughty behaviors, regardless of how we show up, right? And we have the opportunity to make it better or worse, depending on how we respond. And so pre-planning and knowing our own tension points is going to be important, right? Whining, for me, sends me over the edge when my kids whine in a way that it shouldn't. And so I know that about myself, and then can pre-plan what I'm going to do in those responses, right? And so this is this notion of vulnerable decision points, which is those times that we are most likely to react from a place of kind of implicit bias, right? Or just from our gut, right? Rather than from our logical thinking brain. There's certain behaviors that might be triggers for us, right? Like I said, the whining, knowing if I'm hangry, right? Even for me as an adult, if I have a lot of stress, certain relationships, certain kids that maybe just do things that are a little bit harder for me. One of my favorite activities to do is to do this big deal-o-meter, which is to just kind of put behaviors up, throw them out on the wall, things that we've seen, and then personally, where does that fall, right? And then professionally, where should that fall? And when you see those disconnects, right? I had a teacher who did this, and she's like, in my house, not doing something you were asked to do, you were lazy. And so when I ask a kid, even if I know that maybe he doesn't have the skills to do this math sheet, I have to be careful because it goes way over my big deal-o-meter, because I start to interpret that behavior as lazy because of my own upbringing, right? Even though I know in my head and my thinking brain that he's not being lazy, he actually can't do this very well. When I'm not in that thinking brain place, I tend to overreact. So this helps us build those routines. So a neutralizing routine is just a pause. We can identify those places where we're likely to act out of our kind of gut or bias rather than our neutral thinking brain, and then change our response. And so I built in some strategies here, saying things. I had an 8th grade teacher who she started just asking, what can I do to help? When she was experiencing kind of herself get escalated. And she actually had a student who stepped out in the hall and said, nothing. You can't do anything, but here's the 65 things that are happening in my life right now that caused me to blow up when you asked me to do this language arts prompt. So she just started using this, are you okay, can I help line when students were getting escalated in front of her as a way to kind of institute a pause. Some schools do this school-wide, so they teach all of their staff a strategy like the STOP strategy or the TRY strategy. I think at minimum, you want to have this for yourself because you know you're going to be stepping into some of those stressful roles and when you need to take a break or tap out, and then working, as a goal to build this to the school-wide level. this is really great because this is also how kids learn this, right? When I say, I'm taking a deep breath right now, I'm going to walk away from this. I'm going for a walk around the block for a few minutes to my kids, right? They are learning that strategy from me as well because I'm modeling, right, a way to get myself out of a situation that maybe I'm going to react in a way that I wish I wouldn't have. So you should think about what you already use. I just gave you the example of going for the walk or the deep breaths, but you probably already have things that you're using with your own kids or in your own life. And so just being explicit about those. So this is my last bit. In terms of you, just thinking about setting goals for yourself, investing in prevention first. What is that going to look like for you in your role? Find out who should you talk to about what's currently in place in your buildings if you're new to this role? What type of restorative practices are already there, right? What's the school culture and climate, your student population? You might ask also about discipline data that are collected, right? Are there problems that we can anticipate? And then thinking about that last piece of where you might be likely to be vulnerable for taking something personally or reacting from that kind of fight or flight place versus your thinking brain place. Those are the 4 pieces that I would encourage you to take away from this in terms of reasonable goals. So hopefully this has been helpful. I'm happy to give another minute or 2 if you have questions for me or Chris knows where to find me. But I appreciate getting a chance to be in front of you. I wish I was there with you in person so that I could have heard all of your conversations and reflections. But yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it, Billie Jo. Round of applause for Billie Jo. I do have to share, though, there was a little disappointment, Billie Jo, when we first were looking at the list of presenters. Some of our staff saw Billy Joel, and they thought Billy Joel was going to be here this morning. So we may have leaked that as a way to improve our attendance. So apologies, but you were even better than.
I did not include this song and dance in my presentation, but maybe next time.
You were even better than Billy Joel. Thank you so much for kicking off our first session. Like Billie Jo said, if you have any questions or anything or need to get a hold of her, just let us know. We're happy to do that. Appreciate it. Okay, thank you. And let's take 5. Let's come back. We'll get our next presenter set up, and we'll be back at 11:15 on the dot. Oh, we have some questions.
People in the chat were just wondering where to get some of those videos that you showed specifically.
Yes, all of the videos that I shared are YouTube videos. I don't know if they'll play from your PowerPoint, but if they won't, I'm happy to share the links to those, Chris, and then folks can borrow them. They're all publicly available.
And so that you all know what we'll be doing, thank you, Billie Jo. We will be collecting these presentations for those willing to share them, and it sounds like you are. And so we'll send those out to everybody after the summit is concluded. So you will have access to those. Good question. Anything else from the chat? Fabulous. Thank you. All right, 11:15.